The stranger at the gates. The sprawling McAllister estate gleamed under the soft morning sunlight. Its ivy-covered limestone facade and towering wrought iron gates spoke of old money and deep-rooted traditions. The air buzzed with activity as florists, caterers, and decorators hurried about, preparing for the wedding of the year. Eleanor McAllister, the youngest heir to the McAllister family fortune, was set to marry Charles Lennox, a self-made billionaire whose meteoric rise to wealth had captivated the media. Inside the grand estate, Eleanor sat in her bridal suite. The room smelled of fresh roses, and the sunlight streaming through the arched windows highlighted her golden silk gown. Her maid of honor, Claire, adjusted the intricate lace veil, while Eleanor's mother inspected the final details of the ceremony from the doorway. "You look perfect, darling," her mother said, her voice tinged with pride. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Eleanor smiled, though her heart fluttered with nerves. The McAllisters had built their legacy on perfection, flawless appearances, and unshakable reputations. Today was no different. Outside, guests arrived in a parade of luxury cars. Cameramen stood at a respectful distance, snapping photos of the who's who of high society. Charles was already at the altar, adjusting his cuffs and greeting his best man. His cool confidence was one of the many traits that had drawn Eleanor to him. Together, they seemed unstoppable, a power couple destined for greatness. The ceremony began without a hitch. Eleanor's father escorted her down the aisle as his string quartet played a melodic tune. The guests gasped as she appeared, a vision of beauty and poise. Charles's gaze locked onto hers, and his warm smile eased her nerves. They exchanged quiet promises with their eyes, both eager to begin their lives together. But just as the officiant began, the heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom creaked open. A hush fell over the room as heads turned. A young black woman stood in the doorway, her face pale, and her breathing ragged as though she'd been running. Her long hair was disheveled, and her dress, simple but elegant, was stained with dirt. "Stop," she cried, her voice breaking the stillness like shattered glass. "You can't marry her." Gasps erupted from the guests. Eleanor's father frowned, and Charles's brows knit in confusion. Eleanor froze, her hand clutching her bouquet so tightly the stems threatened to snap. The woman stumbled forward, her heels clicking unevenly on the marble floor. "Charles," she said, her voice trembling, "please, you don't understand." "Who are you?" Eleanor's father demanded, stepping forward to intercept her. "Wait," Charles said, holding up a hand. His voice carried an edge of familiarity. "Let her speak." The woman's tear-filled eyes met his, and the room seemed to shrink, the hundreds of staring faces fading into the background. "She's lying to you, Charles. Everything you think you know about her, about this family, is a lie." Eleanor's face turned ashen, and her grip on Charles's hand slackened. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The woman's gaze flicked to Eleanor, her expression a mix of pity and determination. "My name is Aria, and you don't know me, but your father does. He knows the truth about your family, about you. And if this wedding happens, it'll destroy you both." The silence in the room was suffocating. Charles turned to Eleanor, searching her face for answers. "What is she talking about, Eleanor?" I have no idea," Eleanor stammered, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is insane. Someone call security." But Charles held up his hand again, stopping the guards who were already approaching. "No, let her finish." The tension in the room thickened as Aria stepped closer to the altar. Her voice steadied, and she locked eyes with Charles. "You don't know who she really is, Charles, but I do. And if you want to know the truth, you'll meet me tonight, alone." With that, she turned on her heel and strode out of the room, leaving the guests in stunned silence. Eleanor's father barked orders to the security team, but Charles's gaze remained fixed on the doorway, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Eleanor tugged on his arm. "Charles, she's crazy. Don't listen to her. She's just trying to ruin everything. Charles didn't respond. Instead, he looked at the officiant and said quietly, "I'm sorry. We need to pause this." Gasps rippled through the crowd as he stepped back from Eleanor. "What are you doing?" she whispered, panic lacing her voice. "I need answers," he said, his tone firm. "Before we go any further, I need to know what she's talking about." Eleanor's mother rose from her seat, her face a mask of fury. "Charles, don't be ridiculous. This is our daughter's wedding." But Charles' expression was resolute. "I'll make this right, but not until I know the truth." As he left the altar, Eleanor's perfect day shattered around her. The whispers among the guests grew louder, and the photographers outside scrambled for shots of the drama unfolding. In the quiet of his car, Charles stared at the address Aria had left with the wedding coordinator. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He didn't know who this woman was or what she wanted, but her eyes had held something that couldn't be ignored: truth. And tonight, he would find out what that truth was. Aria's secret. The address Aria had scribbled on a torn piece of paper led Charles to an old, weathered cafe in a quiet corner of the city. Unlike the gleaming establishments he was accustomed to, this place had a rustic charm: worn wooden beams, chipped paint, and a flickering neon sign that read Rosie's Diner. It stood in stark contrast to the McAllister grandeur he had left behind. Charles checked the time. 8:47 p.m. He was early, but impatience tugged at him. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress wiped down the counters, and the faint hum of a jukebox played an old blues tune. He slid into a booth near the back, his reflection staring back at him from the chrome surface of the table. A few minutes later, the door opened. Aria entered, her figure framed by the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Gone was the disheveled, desperate woman from earlier. She walked with quiet confidence, her head held high, though her eyes still carried a weight that Charles couldn't place. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm here because you made a serious accusation today." Charles replied, his voice measured but firm. "You owe me an explanation." Aria nodded, her hands fidgeting slightly before resting flat on the table. "You're right. But before I tell you anything, I need you to promise me you'll listen. Really listen." Charles's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "I'm listening." Aria took a deep breath, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "My name is Aria Bennett. I grew up in a small town called Ashton Grove. It's quiet, nothing like the world you're used to. But what it lacks in glamour, it makes up for in community. People look out for each other." Charles leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "What does this have to do with Eleanor or the McAllisters?" Aria's expression hardened. "Everything. Your fiancé's family. They have a dark history, one that ruined mine." Charles frowned but said nothing, letting her continue. "My father, Elijah Bennett, was a successful man in Ashton Grove. He owned a factory that employed half the town. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a leader. People loved him, trusted him." Aria paused, her voice faltering. "But then the McAllisters came to town. They were looking to expand their influence, buy out smaller businesses. My father refused to sell. He believed in independence and standing by his community." She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the table. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Suddenly, inspections of the factory became frequent, too frequent. False accusations of unsafe conditions, lawsuits from nowhere, fines that didn't make sense. My father was buried under it all. Charles shifted in his seat. "You're saying the McAllisters were behind this?" "Yes," Aria said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't realize it at the time. I was just a teenager, watching my father's life crumble. But as I got older, I started digging into what happened. I found connections, payments made to inspectors, lawyers with ties to the McAllister family. It was all orchestrated." Her voice grew quieter. "They destroyed him. My father lost the factory. The stress. It killed him. Charles's throat tightened. He wanted to dismiss her story as a baseless accusation, but the raw emotion in her voice was undeniable. "That's tragic," he said carefully, "but how do you know Eleanor was involved?" "She would have been a child when all this happened." Aria nodded. "You're right. Eleanor was too young to play a part. But the same can't be said for her father, Richard McAllister. He orchestrated it all. And from what I've uncovered, Eleanor's benefited from her family's tactics her entire life." Charles's brow furrowed. "That's a serious claim. Do you have proof?" Aria pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "I spent years gathering this. Emails, financial records, sworn statements from former employees. It's all there." Charles hesitated before opening the folder. The first page was a financial ledger. Payments from a McAllister account matched Aria's claims. Inspectors, lawyers, even local officials had been on the payroll. As he flipped through the pages, his stomach churned. The evidence was damning. "They built their empire by stepping on people like my father," Aria said quietly. "And if you marry into that family, you'll be endorsing everything they've done." Charles closed the folder, his hands trembling. "Why tell me this now? Why not come forward earlier?" Aria's expression softened. "Because I didn't know how far the McAllisters' reach extended. I thought the truth would die with my father. But then I saw your engagement in the news. I saw your face, and I realized I couldn't stay silent." The weight of her words settled over Charles like a heavy fog. He looked at her, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. "I need time to process this," he said finally. Aria nodded, standing. "I understand, but don't take too long, Charles. The McAllisters don't like loose ends." With that, she turned and left the diner, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. The folder sat on the table like a ticking bomb, threatening to destroy everything he thought he knew about Eleanor and her family. Charles sat in the dimly lit diner long after Aria had left, staring at the folder in front of him. His fingers hovered over the worn cover as if it might bite him. His instincts told him to dig deeper, to verify everything Aria had claimed, but his heart resisted. Could Eleanor, the woman he loved, really come from a family capable of such cruelty? The coffee in his mug had gone cold when the waitress approached, refilling it without a word. "You okay, Han?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Charles offered a distracted nod. "Just a lot on my mind." The waitress gave him a knowing look, then left him alone. He finally opened the folder again, flipping through the documents more thoroughly. The evidence Aria provided wasn't circumstantial, it was damning. Emails detailed payments to inspectors who had fabricated safety violations. Deposits traced back to McAllister accounts funded lawyers who had filed baseless lawsuits against Aria's father. There were even handwritten notes from Richard McAllister to his associates, urging them to accelerate the pressure. Charles's stomach churned. If this was true, the McAllister family's empire wasn't built on ambition and hard work, but on crushing others. He pulled out his phone, hesitating before dialing Eleanor's number. As the line rang, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. How could he confront her without jumping to conclusions? And if she didn't know, how would she react to learning her family's wealth came at such a cost? "Charles." Eleanor's voice was warm, but tinged with worry. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed his unease. "I just needed some air." "Air?" she repeated, a note of disbelief creeping in. "You walked out of our wedding, Charles. The guests are gone. My parents are furious, and I'm sitting here wondering what's going on. You left me standing there." Charles closed his eyes, guilt washing over him. "I know, Eleanor. I'm sorry, but something happened today that I can't ignore." "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Who was that woman? What did she say to you?" Charles hesitated. "She told me things about your family, things I need to look into." "My family." Eleanor's voice turned cold. Charles, don't tell me you believed her. She's clearly unstable. My father is already talking to security. No. Charles cut her off, surprising even himself. Don't send anyone after her. She showed me something, Eleanor. Documents. Proof. Proof of what? Eleanor asked sharply, though there was a tremor in her voice. Charles hesitated, his grip tightening on the phone. I don't want to say anything until I know for sure. I need to speak to your father. My father. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. He won't entertain this nonsense, Charles. And frankly, neither should you. Maybe not, Charles replied, his tone firm. But I can't move forward until I get some answers. I'll be home soon. He ended the call before Eleanor could respond, guilt and determination warring within him. Sliding the folder back into his bag, Charles left the diner. He had never felt more uncertain in his life, but one thing was clear. The McAllisters owed him an explanation. Confrontation at the McAllister estate. The McAllister estate was eerily quiet when Charles arrived. The grandeur of its sprawling gardens and towering gates now felt imposing, even menacing. Inside, he found Eleanor waiting in the grand parlor, still in her wedding gown. Her mother and father flanked her, their expressions a mix of anger and concern. Charles, Richard McAllister began, his voice smooth and authoritative. I hope you've come to explain yourself. I've come for answers, Charles said, his voice steady but cold. He set the folder on the coffee table between them. Aria Bennett came to the wedding today. She showed me these. Eleanor glanced at the folder, her eyes narrowing. Charles, we've already established she's lying. Whatever she showed you. She's not lying, Charles interrupted, his voice rising. I've seen the documents. Financial records, emails, notes with your father's name on them. She claims your family destroyed her father's business. Richard's expression darkened. This is absurd. You're taking the word of a stranger over the family you're about to marry into. Charles fixed him with a piercing gaze. So, you're denying it. Richard leaned back, his expression shifting to one of calculated calm. Charles, you've been in business long enough to know how these things work. Competition is fierce. Sometimes decisions are made that, while unfortunate, are necessary. Necessary. Charles's voice was incredulous. Destroying a man's life. Driving his family into ruin. Eleanor stepped forward, her hands clenched. Charles, this has nothing to do with us. Whatever happened back then, it's in the past. Charles turned to her, his eyes filled with disbelief. You can't seriously think this doesn't matter. Your family built their wealth by crushing people like Aria's father. How many others paid the price for your lifestyle? Eleanor's face paled, but she didn't respond. Her mother, however, stepped in. You need to understand, Charles, that success isn't always clean. You're successful. You should know that. There are sacrifices. Charles shook his head, his voice resolute. Sacrifices are one thing. This is calculated cruelty. And if you think I'm going to ignore it, you don't know me at all. Richard's calm facade cracked. Careful, Charles. You're talking about your future family. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Charles met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe you're not the family I want to be part of. A crossroads. Charles left the estate, his heart heavy but his mind clear. The McAllisters weren't going to admit fault, let alone change their ways. As he drove back to his penthouse, his thoughts drifted to Aria and her quiet strength. She had risked everything to tell him the truth. For now, he needed time to think, to decide what mattered more, the future he'd envisioned with Eleanor or standing by his principles. And he needed to find Aria again, to thank her for showing him the truth. Because no matter how painful, the truth was better than living a lie. Truths and consequences. The city skyline twinkled in the evening light as Charles pulled into the underground parking garage of his penthouse. The confrontation at the McAllister estate still played on a loop in his mind. Richard McAllister's cold rationalizations, Eleanor's pale but defiant silence, and the glaring weight of the evidence Aria had handed him. He knew there was no going back. In the quiet of his apartment, Charles poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching the city bustle far below. The drink burned as it went down, but it didn't dull the ache in his chest. He had loved Eleanor, or at least the version of her he thought he knew. The reality was far murkier, stained by her family's past. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from Aria. "I hope you're okay. Let me know if you need more." Charles stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "We need to talk, tomorrow." The reply came almost immediately. 11 a.m. Ashton Grove Cafe. The drive to Ashton Grove. The next morning, Charles drove out to Ashton Grove, the small town Aria had mentioned during their first meeting. The farther he got from the city, the more the landscape changed. Rolling hills replaced skyscrapers, and narrow roads lined with old oak trees led him into a town that felt frozen in time. Ashton Grove had the charm of a postcard. Brick storefronts, a clock tower in the town square, and locals chatting over coffee on outdoor benches. But beneath the surface, Charles sensed a lingering sadness, a collective memory of something lost. Aria was already waiting for him at a corner table in the cafe. She looked different this time, calmer, more composed. Her hair was neatly pulled back, and she wore a simple navy blouse that complemented her natural confidence. "You made it," she said with a small smile. Charles nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I need answers, more than what's in the folder. I need to understand everything." Aria gestured to the waitress, who brought over 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "I figured you might. Where should I start?" "Tell me about your father," Charles said, "and about what happened here." Aria's gaze drifted to the window, where the clock tower loomed over the square. "My father, Elijah Bennett, was the kind of man who believed in fairness. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a pillar of this community. He paid his workers well, treated them like family, and made sure the town thrived." She paused, her fingers wrapping tightly around her coffee mug. When the McAllisters showed up, they didn't just want his factory. They wanted control. My father refused to sell, and that's when the pressure started. At first, it was little things. Delays in shipments, unexpected audits. Then the lawsuits came. Charles leaned forward. "The lawsuits in the folder?" Aria nodded. "Yes. Every one of them was orchestrated by Richard McAllister. He used his connections to create problems where none existed. They claimed the factory was unsafe, that my father violated labor laws. None of it was true, but defending himself drained every penny he had." Her voice wavered as she continued. "He lost everything. The factory was seized. Families who depended on those jobs were left with nothing. And my father, he didn't just lose his business. He lost his will to fight. A year later, he had a heart attack." "I'm sorry," Charles said quietly. "That must have been devastating." "It was," Aria admitted, her eyes glistening. "But I couldn't let it end there. I started digging into what happened, connecting the dots. It took years, but I finally uncovered the truth. The McAllisters were behind it all." Charles rubbed his temples, the weight of the story sinking in. "And Eleanor, did she know?" "I don't think she does," Aria said. "She was young when it happened, and Richard wouldn't have told her. But that doesn't change the fact that her family benefited from my father's downfall." Charles sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Eleanor isn't her father. She might not even know the full extent of this." Aria's gaze softened. "Maybe. But if you're going to marry her, you need to make sure she's willing to face the truth and to take responsibility." Confronting Eleanor. Later that afternoon, Charles drove back to the city. The weight of Aria's story pressed heavily on him as he parked outside Eleanor's downtown condo. She had texted earlier, asking him to come by, her tone pleading. When she opened the door, she was dressed casually, a stark contrast to the poised perfection she usually exuded. Her face lit up when she saw him, but her expression quickly turned wary as she noticed his guarded demeanor. "Charles," she began, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm glad you're here." He walked past her into the living room, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Eleanor, we need to talk." She crossed her arms, her brows knitting together. "If this is about that woman, I don't see what else there is to say. My father is handling it." "No," Charles interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't something your father can handle. This is about what your family did to hers." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Charles, you're not seriously believing." "I've seen the evidence," he said, cutting her off. "Emails, payments, everything. Your father systematically destroyed Aria's family to expand his empire, and your family has profited from that ever since." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, as though she were searching for the right words. "I don't know anything about that. Whatever my father did, I had no part in it." "That's not good enough," Charles said, his voice hard. "You can't just wash your hands of it. This isn't some distant connection. Your family ruined lives." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "Charles, I love you. This has nothing to do with us. Whatever my father did, it's in the past." Charles shook his head. "It has everything to do with us. If we're going to build a future together, it has to be built on truth, not lies, not the ruins of someone else's life." Her eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to know that you're willing to face this," Charles said. "That you're willing to stand up to your family and make this right." Eleanor hesitated, her lip trembling. "And if I'm not?" Charles's heart ached, but he held her gaze. "Then I don't know if we have a future." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Eleanor looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to think." Charles nodded, his expression unreadable. "So do I." A turning point. As Charles left Eleanor's condo, he felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. He loved Eleanor, but love wasn't enough. Not without honesty, accountability, and integrity. He knew now that the McAllisters' sins couldn't be ignored, and if Eleanor wasn't willing to face them, then their relationship was built on a shaky foundation. Back in his car, he pulled out his phone and dialed Aria. "Hello," she answered, her voice tentative. "I've made my decision," Charles said. "I'm not sure where this leaves Eleanor and me, but one thing is certain. I'm not going to let what happened to your family be buried. The truth deserves to be heard." Aria's silence spoke volumes before she finally replied. "Thank you, Charles. You don't know what that means to me." As the call ended, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just about love or marriage. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. Charles drove aimlessly through the city streets after leaving Eleanor's condo. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind a storm of emotions. The reality of the McAllisters' past felt like a weight he couldn't shake, and Eleanor's unwillingness to confront it made him question everything. He finally pulled over at a small park nestled between high-rise buildings. The sight of children laughing on a nearby playground and joggers weaving along the path reminded him of simpler, more innocent moments. But innocence didn't last forever. Something Aria had learned the hard way. Charles stepped out of the car and sat on a wooden bench, dialing his lawyer's number. "Mr. Lennox," Sarah Chen greeted him warmly. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. Is everything all right?" "Not quite," Charles said. "I need you to look into something for me, discreetly. There's a history with the McAllister family I've uncovered, and I need to know just how deep it goes. Find anything you can about Richard McAllister's dealings over the past 20 years, particularly with small businesses." There was a pause on the line before Sarah responded. "I can certainly look into it, but this sounds sensitive. Should I loop in anyone else?" "No," Charles said firmly. "Keep this between us for now. I need facts before I decide what to do." A meeting with Aria. The following day, Charles met Aria again at the Ashton Grove Cafe. The morning light streamed through the windows, bathing the cozy space in warmth. Aria looked more at ease than before, though a hint of weariness lingered in her eyes. "You look tired," she said as Charles slid into the seat across from her. "Let's just say it's been a long 24 hours," Charles replied with a faint smile. "I spoke to Eleanor. And her father. And—" Aria leaned forward, her expression guarded. Charles sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They didn't deny it. Richard called it necessary business, and Eleanor, she's struggling to process it, but she hasn't committed to addressing it." Aria nodded slowly, her jaw tightening. "That doesn't surprise me. People like Richard McAllister don't think they've done anything wrong. To them, people like my father are just obstacles." "I don't want to believe Eleanor is like that," Charles said, his voice heavy. "But if she won't face the truth, I don't see how we move forward." Aria studied him for a moment, then said, "You're caught in a tough spot, Charles. But you're doing the right thing. Facing this head-on, it takes courage." He met her gaze, finding unexpected comfort in her steady demeanor. "I'm not sure where this leaves me and Eleanor, but I know one thing. I want to help you. Your father's story deserves justice." Aria's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You mean that?" Charles nodded. "I've already contacted my lawyer. We're looking into the McAllisters' dealings. If we can build a case, we will." Aria's shoulders relaxed, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you, Charles. That means more than you know." A breakthrough. A week later, Sarah Chen called Charles with an update. He was in his office, reviewing contracts for a new investment project, when his phone buzzed. "I found something," Sarah said, her tone clipped and professional. "A series of shell companies tied to the McAllisters' name. They were used to funnel money for bribes, payoffs, and false lawsuits, exactly what Aria described." Charles leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. "How recent are we talking?" "The activity slowed down in the last 5 years, but it dates back decades," Sarah continued. "And here's the kicker. There's evidence suggesting Richard wasn't acting alone. Several other prominent business people were involved, creating what looks like a coordinated effort to monopolize industries." Charles frowned. "Do you have names?" "I'm still digging, but I can tell you this. It's not just about the past. These networks are still active, just operating more discreetly." A sense of unease settled over Charles. The McAllisters' tactics weren't just relics of a bygone era. They were ongoing. And by marrying Eleanor, he risked aligning himself with a legacy of corruption. Eleanor's ultimatum. Later that evening, Eleanor arrived at Charles's penthouse unannounced. She looked radiant, as always, but there was a hardness in her eyes that Charles hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said, walking past him into the living room. Charles closed the door, steeling himself. "I agree." Eleanor turned to face him, crossing her arms. "I've thought about what you said, about my family. And while I understand why you're upset, I can't stand by and let you judge us based on the past." "This isn't just about the past, Eleanor," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about accountability. Your family destroyed lives to build their fortune. That doesn't go away because it happened years ago. My father did what he thought was best," Eleanor snapped. "He built a legacy for us. For me, you don't get to sit there and act like you're above it all. You've benefited from ruthless decisions in business, too." Charles's jaw tightened. "Not like this. Not by tearing apart entire communities." Eleanor's voice softened, but her tone remained resolute. "Charles, I love you. But I'm not going to apologize for my family's success. If you can't accept that, then maybe this engagement was a mistake." The words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. He had hoped Eleanor would meet him halfway, that she would see the necessity of addressing her family's wrongs. But her stance was clear. He took a deep breath, his decision crystallizing. "Maybe it was," he said quietly. Eleanor's eyes widened, hurt flashing across her face. "You're really going to throw this away?" Charles met her gaze, his own filled with sadness. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what's right. And if you can't see that, then we don't belong together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor turned and walked toward the door. Goodbye, Charles, she said softly, her voice trembling. As the door closed behind her, Charles felt a wave of grief, but also a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on the right path. A plan for justice. The next morning, Charles met with Sarah and Aria to strategize. They spread documents, timelines, and witness statements across the table in Charles's conference room. We need to make this public, Aria said. The McAllisters have hidden behind their power for too long. Sarah nodded. We can present the evidence to the authorities, but I recommend coordinating with a journalist, someone with credibility who can expose the story thoroughly. Charles agreed. I'll reach out to a contact I trust. This has to be done carefully, or it could backfire. As the three of them worked late into the night, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had lost Eleanor, but he had gained something far more valuable. The chance to make things right. The price of redemption. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity for Charles, Aria, and Sarah as they prepared to expose the McAllisters' dark legacy. Every document was scrutinized, every witness vetted. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they unearthed, not just from Richard McAllister, but from a web of associates who had benefited from his schemes. The journalist, one of Charles's contacts, investigative journalist Rachel Nguyen, agreed to take on the story. Rachel was known for her fearless reporting and her knack for uncovering truths others wanted to remain buried. When Charles met her in her modest but bustling office, she wasted no time getting to the point. This isn't just a story, Rachel said, flipping through the thick binder of evidence they'd provided. This is a bombshell. If we go forward with this, the McAllisters' entire empire could collapse. Are you ready for that? Charles nodded, his expression grim. It's what needs to happen. Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying him. You're walking away from a lot, Charles. The McAllisters' influence is massive. You might lose more than just your engagement. I've already lost Eleanor, he said quietly. But I won't lose my integrity. Rachel's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. All right then, but we need more than documents. We need human stories, people willing to speak out. I can help with that, Aria said. She had insisted on coming to the meeting, her determination unwavering. There are others in Ashton Grove who were affected. I'll talk to them. Rachel nodded. Good. The more voices, the better. Let's bring the truth to light. The fallout begins. As Rachel's investigation gained momentum, word began to spread. The McAllisters had long been untouchable, but now cracks were forming in their gilded facade. Charles knew it was only a matter of time before Richard and Eleanor learned about the impending expose. It came sooner than he expected. One evening, as he returned to his penthouse, Charles found Richard McAllister waiting for him in the lobby. Flanked by two imposing security guards, Richard's usual air of composed authority was replaced with barely concealed rage. We need to talk, Richard said curtly, brushing past Charles into the elevator. When they reached Charles' apartment, Richard wasted no time. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice echoing in the spacious living room. I'm exposing the truth, Charles replied calmly, setting his briefcase down. You should have seen this coming. Richard's lips curled into a sneer. This isn't about truth. This is about revenge. That woman, Aria Bennett, has poisoned your mind with her lies. Charles crossed his arms, unflinching. They're not lies. I've seen the evidence, Richard. The emails, the payments, the lawsuits. This isn't some misunderstanding. It's a pattern of exploitation. Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. You're making a mistake, Charles. You think you're some kind of hero. You'll bring down my family, but you'll go down with us. No one crosses the McAllisters and comes out unscathed. Charles met his gaze, his voice steady. That's where you're wrong. You built your empire on the suffering of others. I won't be complicit in that. And neither will anyone else once the truth comes out. For a moment, Richard seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't expected such defiance. Then his expression hardened. You've chosen your side, Lennox. Don't say I didn't warn you. As Richard stormed out, Charles felt a mixture of fear and resolve. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back. The human cost. Meanwhile, Arya worked tirelessly to gather testimonies from others affected by the McAllisters' actions. She visited families in Ashton Grove, listening to their stories of lost livelihoods and shattered dreams. One by one, they agreed to share their experiences with Rachel. There was Mary Caldwell, whose bakery had been forced to close after Richard used his connections to corner the local grain market, and Jacob Lee, a former factory worker who had lost everything when the plant was seized. Each story added another layer to the narrative of greed and destruction. But not everyone was willing to speak out. Fear still gripped many in Ashton Grove, a testament to the McAllisters' lingering influence. They've controlled this town for decades, Arya said to Charles during one of their late-night strategy meetings. Even now, people are scared of what they might do. Charles frowned. We have to show them that standing up is worth the risk. That together, we're stronger than they are. Eleanor's plea. The night before Rachel's exposé was set to publish, Eleanor showed up at Charles's penthouse unannounced. She looked worn, her usually flawless appearance marred by dark circles under her eyes. Charles, she said, her voice trembling. Please, don't do this. Charles stood by the window, his back to her. It's already done, Eleanor. She moved closer, desperation in her tone. You don't understand. If this story goes public, it won't just hurt my father. It'll destroy everything. Our name, our legacy. It'll all be gone. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Maybe it should be. Her eyes filled with tears. You don't mean that. My family isn't perfect, but we're not monsters. Can't we find another way? There is no other way, Charles said firmly. Your father made choices that ruined lives. He has to face the consequences. And me, she whispered. Do I mean so little to you? Charles's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. You mean everything to me, Eleanor. But love doesn't excuse wrongdoing. If you truly care about what's right, you'll stand with me, not against me. Eleanor stared at him, her tears falling freely. I don't know if I can. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. The truth revealed. The following morning, Rachel's story broke. It dominated headlines across the country, the McAllisters' carefully curated image shattered by the weight of the evidence. The expose detailed decades of corruption, complete with interviews from victims, leaked emails, and financial records. Public outrage was swift. Protests erupted outside McAllister properties, and government agencies announced investigations into their business practices. Richard McAllister issued a statement denying the allegations, but his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. For Arya, the moment was bittersweet. My father didn't live to see this day, she told Charles as they watched the news coverage. But I think he'd be proud. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder. You did this, Arya. You gave him justice. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, the McAllisters' empire crumbled. Lawsuits piled up, and Richard faced criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. Eleanor disappeared from the public eye, her once bright future dimmed by her family's disgrace. For Charles, the experience was transformative. He had walked away from the life he thought he wanted, but in doing so, he had found something far more meaningful, a commitment to truth and integrity. As he stood on the balcony of his penthouse one evening, gazing at the city lights, he felt a sense of peace. The price of redemption had been steep, but it was worth it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Arya standing there, a small smile on her face. "Thought you might need this," she said, holding up a bottle of wine. Charles chuckled. "You have no idea." As they sat together, the weight of the past finally began to lift. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The public reaction. The day after Rachel Nguyen's expose hit the news, the McAllister name was on everyone's lips, but not in the way Eleanor or her family would have ever imagined. Major news outlets picked up the story, splashing it across headlines. McAllister empire built on exploitation. Decades of corruption exposed. Social media exploded with hashtags like #McAllister and #JusticeForIshtongrove. Thousands of people across the country came forward, sharing their own stories of small businesses crushed by large corporations, with some even connecting their experiences to McAllister's reach. For Aria, it was a moment of vindication. She watched the news from her modest apartment, her phone buzzing constantly with messages of support from friends and strangers alike. One message from an elderly man in Ashton Grove stood out. "You've given our town hope again. Thank you." For Charles, the fallout was bittersweet. While he was relieved that the truth had come to light, he also knew this was just the beginning. The McAllisters wouldn't go down quietly, and their lawyers were already working overtime to contain the damage. The McAllister response. Richard McAllister held a press conference 2 days after the expose, standing behind a polished podium in the grand foyer of his estate. His face was composed, but the strain showed in the lines around his eyes. "These allegations are baseless," he began, his voice steady. "They are the work of disgruntled individuals seeking to tarnish my family's legacy. We will fight these claims vigorously." But as he spoke, the cracks in his polished veneer began to show. Questions from reporters grew sharper. "Mr. McAllister, how do you explain the documented payments to inspectors and lawyers tied to your acquisitions? Can you deny the sworn testimonies from former employees in Ashton Grove? Is your daughter, Eleanor, aware of these actions?" Richard sidestepped the questions, repeating vague statements about ongoing investigations and family integrity. But the damage was done. The press conference ended with more skepticism than support. Eleanor's struggle. For Eleanor, the scandal was a nightmare. She had retreated to her family's countryside estate, far from the cameras and reporters camped outside the McAllister mansion in the city. She spent hours in her room, scrolling through articles and social media posts that painted her family in the worst possible light. Her father's assurances did little to comfort her. "This will blow over," Richard had said over dinner the night before, his tone dismissive. "People have short memories. We've weathered worse." But Eleanor wasn't so sure. For the first time, she began to question everything she'd been taught about loyalty, family, and success. The evidence against her father was overwhelming, and deep down, she couldn't deny its truth. What haunted her most, however, was Charles's parting words. "If you can't see what's right, we don't belong together." Eleanor knew she had a choice to make: stand by her father or face the truth, no matter the cost. Legal battles begin. Meanwhile, Charles and Aria worked with Rachel and Sarah Chen to bring the evidence to the authorities. The Department of Justice launched an investigation into the McAllisters' business practices, focusing on the shell companies and fraudulent lawsuits that had crushed businesses like Aria's father's. Richard McAllister was summoned to testify before a congressional committee. The hearings were broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers eager to see the once untouchable tycoon answer for his actions. "I have no knowledge of these transactions," Richard claimed, his voice calm but clipped. "These were decisions made by lower-level employees. To suggest otherwise is preposterous." But the evidence said otherwise. Emails with Richard's personal signature approving payments and memos outlining strategies to bankrupt competitors painted a damning picture. The committee members grilled him relentlessly, and public opinion turned sharply against him. A visit from Eleanor. One evening, as Charles reviewed documents in his penthouse, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Eleanor standing there, her face pale but determined. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Charles stepped aside, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "I've been thinking about everything. About you. About what my family has done." Charles crossed his arms, studying her. And you were right," she admitted, her voice breaking. "About all of it. My father isn't the man I thought he was. He's done terrible things, and I can't pretend otherwise." Charles softened but remained cautious. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying I want to help," she said, stepping closer. "I've seen the documents. I've read the emails. I know things that could strengthen your case." Charles's eyes widened. "You'd testify against your father?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's the only way to make this right." The turning point. Eleanor's decision to testify was a bombshell. Her deposition provided critical insight into the McAllister family's inner workings, confirming many of the allegations Aria and Charles had uncovered. Her testimony also revealed new information, implicating several of Richard's closest associates. The media hailed Eleanor as a whistleblower, though public opinion was divided. Some praised her courage, while others accused her of betraying her family. For Eleanor, the decision wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. "For too long, I've been complicit in my family's actions," she said in a public statement. "But silence is no longer an option." Justice served. Months later, the Department of Justice filed formal charges against Richard McAllister and several of his associates. The trial was one of the most high-profile cases in years, with witnesses from Ashton Grove and beyond sharing their stories in heartbreaking detail. Richard's defense team fought hard, but the evidence was insurmountable. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a guilty verdict on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Richard McAllister was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The McAllister empire was dismantled, its assets sold off to pay restitution to the victims. A new chapter. With the case behind them, Charles and Aria returned to Ashton Grove for a quiet celebration. The town had begun to heal, its people reclaiming their sense of pride and community. The old factory that had once been the heart of the town was being restored, funded by the restitution money. Standing outside the factory, Charles turned to Aria. "This is what it's all about," he said. "Making things right." Aria smiled, her eyes bright with hope. "Thank you, Charles, for believing in me, for fighting for this." Charles shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. You started this. You gave me the courage to stand up." As the sun set over Ashton Grove, they stood together, knowing that while the fight for justice was never easy, it was always worth it. Rebuilding from the ruins. Ashton Grove was alive with renewal. The once abandoned factory now hummed with activity, its old red brick facade restored to its former glory. Inside, workers moved about, installing modern equipment while engineers finalized plans to launch the new facility. It was no longer the McAllisters' empire that dictated the town's future, but the collective spirit of its people. Charles had personally overseen the factory's restoration, partnering with area and local leaders to create a community-owned business. They called it the Bennett Cooperative in honor of Aria's father, Elijah Bennett, whose legacy had inspired the project. A town restored. The reopening ceremony was set for a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the entire town gathered to celebrate. Children ran through the streets with balloons, elderly residents reminisced about the factory's heyday, and vendors set up booths offering homemade goods. Aria stood near the factory gates, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that reflected her role as both a leader and a symbol of resilience. Charles joined her, dressed casually, though his presence carried the air of quiet authority. The townspeople greeted him warmly, no longer seeing him as an outsider, but as one of their own. "This feels surreal," Aria said, glancing at the large banner that read Bennett Cooperative Grand Opening. "You made it happen," Charles replied, his voice filled with admiration. "You took a dream and turned it into reality." "We did it," she corrected, giving him a soft smile. As the mayor stepped onto the makeshift stage to address the crowd, the applause was deafening. He spoke of the factory's history, the hardships the town had endured, and the hope that now lay ahead. When he invited Aria to speak, she hesitated, but Charles gave her an encouraging nod. Taking the microphone, Aria looked out over the crowd, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "This isn't just a factory. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. My father believed in this town, in its people, and today we're proving that his faith wasn't misplaced." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Aria stepped down, Charles couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride, not just for her, but for everything they had accomplished together. Eleanor's journey. Meanwhile, Eleanor had begun her own path to redemption. The fallout from her testimony had left her estranged from her family, but she found solace in knowing she had done the right thing. She had moved to a quiet coastal town, far from the chaos of her former life, and taken up volunteer work with a nonprofit dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and corporate accountability. One afternoon, Eleanor sent Charles a letter. It was handwritten, the neat script a far cry from the cold, formal emails they had once exchanged. "Dear Charles, I've been thinking about everything. About us, about what we lost, and about what we gained. Standing up to my father was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. I'm learning what it means to build something honest, to live for myself instead of my family's expectations. And while I miss you, I know we're on different paths now. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, for standing firm, for fighting for what's right. Thank you for showing me what integrity looks like. Yours, Eleanor." Charles read the letter in his penthouse late one evening, a mix of emotions swirling within him. Eleanor's words held a sense of closure, a recognition that while their love hadn't endured, it had been a catalyst for change. A growing partnership. Back in Ashton Grove, the Bennett Cooperative thrived. The factory wasn't just a business, it was a community hub. Profits were reinvested into the town, upgrading schools, repairing infrastructure, and supporting local entrepreneurs. Charles and Aria's partnership deepened as they worked side by side, but their relationship began to evolve beyond professional boundaries. Late nights in the factory's office turned into quiet dinners, where they shared stories of their lives before the McAllister scandal. Over time, their connection grew into something neither had expected. One evening, as they walked through the town square, Charles hesitated before saying, "You've changed my life, Aria." She looked at him, her eyes warm but teasing. "Is that so?" He nodded, his expression serious. "You showed me what real courage looks like, and you reminded me of what matters: people, integrity, and the strength to fight for both." Aria smiled softly, but before she could respond, a group of children ran past, laughing as they carried homemade lanterns. The moment was interrupted, but the unspoken understanding between them lingered. National recognition. Months later, Rachel Nguyen's continued reporting on the McAllister scandal earned her a Pulitzer Prize. In her acceptance speech, she credited the courage of whistleblowers like Aria and Eleanor, as well as Charles's determination to bring justice. The Bennett Cooperative also gained national attention as a model for ethical business practices. It became a case study in universities, and Charles was invited to speak at conferences about corporate responsibility. He used every opportunity to highlight the importance of transparency and accountability in business, often bringing Aria along to share her story. A quiet proposal. One crisp autumn evening, Charles and Aria stood on a hill overlooking Ashton Grove. The town lights twinkled below, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. "I never thought I'd find myself here," Aria said, her voice soft. "After everything that happened, I thought this town would always feel like a place of loss." Charles turned to her, his gaze steady. "And now? Now it feels like home," she admitted. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. "Then maybe it's time we made it official." Aria's eyes widened, and for a moment, she was speechless. "Charles, "I've watched you rebuild this town, this factory, and your life," he said. "You've shown me what strength and compassion look like. I want to build a future with you, a real one, built on everything we've learned." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes." Charles slipped the ring onto her finger, and as they embraced, the town bells chimed in the distance, marking the hour but feeling like a celebration of something far greater, a future of integrity. Charles and Aria's journey wasn't just a love story. It was a testament to the power of truth and resilience. Together, they transformed a legacy of corruption into one of hope and integrity, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with courage and determination. As they walked hand in hand back toward the town, the future felt bright, not just for them, but for everyone who had fought for justice. A new beginning. Charles and Aria's quiet engagement soon became a source of inspiration for Ashton Grove and beyond. Unlike the lavish displays of wealth Charles was once accustomed to, their union symbolized simplicity and authenticity, values they had fought to uphold. The couple decided to hold their wedding in Ashton Grove, with the town as their extended family. The factory's spacious courtyard, once a place of hardship, would now host a celebration of new beginnings. As word spread, the entire community rallied to help. The florist donated wildflowers from her garden. The town baker, who had once struggled to stay afloat, crafted a stunning but simple cake adorned with fresh berries. Local musicians volunteered to play, their melodies weaving through the courtyard, as if telling the town's story. The ceremony. The day of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, with sunlight spilling over the rolling hills surrounding Ashton Grove. Rows of white chairs lined the factory courtyard, their simplicity a stark contrast to the opulence Charles had left behind. Lanterns hung from the newly planted oak trees, casting a warm glow as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Aria stood in the small bridal suite they had set up inside the factory. Her dress, a flowing ivory gown with delicate lace accents, was a gift from a group of town seamstresses who had worked tirelessly to create it. It was perfect, not flashy, but full of love and care. "You look radiant," said Mary Caldwell, the town baker, who had become one of Aria's closest friends. "Your father would be so proud." Aria smiled, her eyes glistening. "I hope so." Outside, Charles adjusted his tie, his nerves tingling with anticipation. He wore a tailored navy suit, but instead of the designer label he once flaunted, it was handmade by a local craftsman. His best man, Greg, nudged him with a grin. "You ready for this?" Charles laughed softly. "More than I've ever been." As the ceremony began, Aria appeared at the courtyard's entrance, her arm linked with her mother's. The crowd gasped softly, not at her beauty alone, but at the depth of the moment, the culmination of a journey that had brought them all together. Charles's eyes met Aria's, and everything else faded away. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a promise, a vow not only to love each other, but to honor the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. The officiant, a retired teacher from the town, spoke warmly about love built on trust and courage. When it came time for vows, Aria's voice was steady but full of emotion. "Charles," she began, "you walked into my life when I thought I had nothing left to fight for. You gave me hope when I thought the world had forgotten us. Today, I promise to stand by your side as we build a life that's honest and full of purpose. Together, we'll continue to fight for what's right." Charles took her hands, his voice steady but full of love. "Aria, you've shown me what it means to truly live, to fight for more than just success, for community, for justice, and for love. I promise to honor you, to support you, and to continue the work we've started, no matter where life takes us." As they exchanged rings, the crowd erupted into applause, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Charles and Aria sealed their vows with a kiss that spoke of triumph and unity, a celebration of community. The reception was a joyful affair, filled with laughter, music, and stories. Tables were adorned with wildflower arrangements and handwritten notes of gratitude from Aria and Charles. Guests feasted on dishes made with ingredients donated by local farmers, and the air buzzed with a sense of pride and renewal. Eleanor, who had been invited despite the complexities of their past, stood quietly at the edge of the celebration. When Aria noticed her, she walked over. "Thank you for coming," Aria said sincerely. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You didn't have to invite me." Aria shook her head. "You chose to stand up, Eleanor. That's not something I'll ever forget." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "You're stronger than I ever imagined. And I'm glad Charles found someone who truly deserves him." As Eleanor slipped away into the night, Charles joined Aria, wrapping an arm around her. "What did she say?" "She's finding her own path," Aria replied, leaning into him. "Like we all are. A legacy of hope." In the months that followed, the Bennett Cooperative continued to thrive, expanding to include training programs for local youth and partnerships with nearby communities. Charles and Aria became a formidable team, using their story to inspire others to challenge corruption and prioritize integrity. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. They were invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing how they had turned tragedy into hope. And while they appreciated the recognition, their hearts always led them back to Ashton Grove, where their roots had grown deepest. A quiet evening. One evening, months after their wedding, Charles and Aria sat on the porch of their modest home overlooking the hills. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "Do you ever miss the city?" Aria asked, sipping tea from a handmade mug. Charles smiled, shaking his head. "Not for a second. This." He gestured to the landscape, the town below, and the life they'd built. "This is everything I never knew I needed." Aria leaned against him, her voice soft. "We've come a long way." "And we're just getting started," Charles replied, kissing her forehead. As the stars began to emerge, they sat in comfortable silence, knowing that their fight for justice had not only rebuilt a town, but had also given them a love and purpose that would guide them for the rest of their lives.